The blizzard of January 1863 was the worst Minnesota had seen in 20 years. The wind came howling down from Canada at 70 miles an hour, driving snow so thick that men froze within arm's reach of their own front doors. Homesteads disappeared under drifts 15 feet deep. Livestock died standing up frozen solid before they could lie down. Judge Aldrich Marsh led the search party himself, trudging through the white death, with 17 men behind him looking for survivors in the eastern townships. They found the Hendrickson cabin collapsed under the weight of the snow, all four souls lost. They found the Peterson homestead buried so deep that only the chimney showed above the surface, three people barely alive inside their lips, blue, their fingers black. They found death after death, frozen tragedy after frozen tragedy. And with each body pulled from the snow, the search party moved slower, talked less, believed less that anyone else could still be breathing. And on the third day, they walked directly over the roof of Clara Holberg's home. 17 times in 3 days, their snowshoes crunched across a hillside that looked exactly like every other hillside for miles around. Beneath the snow, beneath the frozen prairie grass, beneath earth that held its warmth the way a mother holds a sleeping child, Clara sat by her fire and listened to the footsteps passing overhead. She heard the searchers calling out names that didn't belong to her. She heard them discussing whether any woman could have survived alone for 7 years in this wilderness. She heard Judge Marsh declare for the fourth time in 7 years that she must be dead. She wasn't dead. She had simply learned to disappear. But to understand how a woman could vanish from the surface of the earth and live beneath it for 7 winters, while the entire county believed her bones were scattered across the prairie, you have to go back. Back to the autumn of 1856 when Clara Holberg was 26 years old and the world still made sense. They had been married for 3 years, Clara and Eric Holberg. 3 years of building something from nothing on 40 acres of Minnesota prairie that the government said was theirs if they could prove they deserved it. Clear the land, build a dwelling, work the claim, show that you belong here and the land belongs to you. Eric was a carpenter by trade, a quiet man from Uppsala who spoke more with his hands than his mouth and who could look at a stand of timber and see the house hiding inside it. Clara had married him in St. Paul when she was 23, fresh off the boat from Gothenburg, barely speaking English, knowing nothing about prairie life except that it was supposed to be better than what she'd left behind. And for 3 years it was. On a Thursday afternoon in late September, 2 weeks before the fever came, Eric was fixing the fence along the south pasture, and Clara was holding the post steady while he drove them in. The air smelled like cut grass and coming winter. Eric missed a swing, bent a nail sideways, and laughed at himself the way he always did when his hands failed to match what his mind intended. Crooked or straight, he said, tapping the bent nail flush. Anyway, it still holds the roof. What matters is that it's there. Clara would remember that sentence for the rest of her life, not because it was wise or beautiful, but because it was the last ordinary thing he ever said to her. 2 weeks later, the fever swept through the territory like a scythe through wheat, and Eric was gone in 5 days. 5 days. That's all it took to turn Clara from a wife into a widow, from a partner into a woman alone, from someone who belonged to someone the world would try to erase. The fever took Eric on a Tuesday. By Wednesday morning, Clara was digging his grave in the hard ground behind their cabin, and she was digging it alone. The earth was already freezing. October in Minnesota, and the ground fought back against the shovel, like it didn't want to open, like it was trying to protect itself from what was about to be put inside it. Clara dug through the afternoon and into the night. When the shovel hit rock, she built a fire on the frozen ground and waited for the heat to soften the earth beneath it, then scraped away the warm soil inch by inch and built another fire and waited again. Her hands blistered in the first hour. The blisters broke in the second. By midnight, her palms were raw meat gripping a wooden handle, and the grave was still only 3 feet deep. No one came to help. The fever had the whole territory locked behind closed doors, every family afraid that the next knock would bring the sickness inside. Ruth Calloway, the widow who lived on the homestead 3 miles east, Clara's only real friend in the territory, sent word through a man passing on the road. A folded piece of paper with 6 words on it. Cannot come. Fever spreading. God bless. Clara read it by firelight, standing in her husband's half-dug grave, and put the note in her pocket without expression. She went back to digging. By dawn, the hole was deep enough. She wrapped Eric in the quilt they'd brought from St. Paul, and one with the blue pattern that his mother had made, and she lowered him in alone. No minister came to read scripture. No neighbors came to stand with bowed heads. Just Clara in the cold earth, in a silence so complete that she could hear the blood moving through her own ears. She filled the grave. She placed a wooden cross. She did not cry because something in her had shifted during those hours of digging. Some internal mechanism that controlled grief had been overwhelmed and simply shut down, the way a flooded engine stops and will not restart no matter how many times you turn the key. She would not cry again for years. 3 days later, Judge Aldrich Marsh rode up to the cabin on a brown horse with a lawyer sitting behind him. Marsh was a man of perhaps 50 with a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same granite that made up the county courthouse, and eyes that calculated value the way a butcher calculates weight. He wore authority the way other men wore coats casually but constantly, and he had been waiting for this visit since the day Eric filed the original land claim. "Your husband's claim reverts to the territory," he told Clara, still sitting on his horse, not bothering to dismount for a conversation he expected to be short. "A woman cannot hold land alone. You'll need to remarry or sell." Clara stood in front of the cabin she had helped build with her own hands, the cabin where she had spent 3 years learning to be a wife and a homesteader and a person who mattered. She looked up at Marsh. "I'll stay." "You can't stay. The law is clear. The law says I needed to improve the land, build a dwelling, work the claim. The dwelling is built. The land is being worked. I'll stay." Marsh studied her. He saw a small woman in a worn dress with bandaged hands and dirt under her fingernails, and eyes that had stopped crying 2 days ago. He saw someone who didn't understand how the world worked, who didn't grasp that laws were written by men for men, and that a widow on the prairie was not a person but a problem to be solved. And behind her, beyond the cabin, rising up the gentle slope to the north, he saw the timber. Cottonwood and oak, thick stands of it covering the hillside, worth more than the land in the cabin and everything else combined. A lumber company in St. Paul had already expressed interest. Marsh had already borrowed against the expected profit. "You won't survive winter," he said, and his voice carried the absolute certainty of a man who had watched this territory kill stronger people than the woman standing before him. "No woman survives winter alone out here. By spring I'll file for abandonment, and the land will be registered in my name." He turned his horse, and then he said something to the lawyer riding behind him, something he didn't think Clara could hear because the wind was picking up, and she was just a widow, and widows don't matter enough to whisper around. But the wind shifted at exactly the wrong moment, and Clara heard every word. "The lumber company wants the timber by March. If she's not dead by then, I'll need another way." The lawyer asked, "And if she doesn't die?" Marsh was quiet for the moment. Then he said, "Everyone dies in winter. It's just a question of when." Clara watched them ride away. She stood in front of her cabin until they were small shapes on the horizon, and then she stood there longer until the horizon swallowed them completely. The wind blew across 40 acres of land that bore her husband's name and her sweat and her blood, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, and Clara Holberg was alone. She went inside. She sat at the table where she and Eric had eaten their meals for 3 years. She looked at her bandaged hands. She understood with a clarity that felt like swallowing ice water that Marsh was not her only problem. Marsh was a symptom. The disease was everything else. The next morning, Clara walked 7 miles to town. Her boots were wearing thin, and the cold was already building toward what the old settlers said would be a killing winter. But she walked because she had no horse and no one to drive her, and because walking was the only thing she could still do for herself. She went to see Reverend Harlan Webb. Webb was the minister of the only church in the township, a man of 55 with silver hair and a voice that could fill a room like warm water fills a basin. He was respected. He was trusted. He was, Clara believed, the one person in the territory who might stand between her and Marsh's appetite for her land. He received her kindly. He offered her tea. He listened to her story with his hands folded and his expression arranged in the particular shape of compassion that ministers learn the way carpenters learn to use a level. And when she finished, when she had laid out the facts of her situation, the land claimed the threat from Marsh. The law that said she needed to prove she could work the land alone. Reverend Webb leaned forward in his chair and said the words that removed the last plank from beneath her feet. "Clara, the Lord designed women to have a man beside them. You should listen to Judge Marsh. Find a new husband or sell the land and return east to your family. Living alone on the prairie is not God's intention for a woman." Clara looked at him. She looked at the silver cross on his desk, at the leather Bible, at the framed letter on the wall from the St. Paul Diocese thanking him for his service to the community. She looked at all the machinery of righteousness arranged around a man who was telling her that God agreed with the person trying to steal her land. God's intention, she said quietly, or Marsh's. Webb's expression changed. It was small tightening around the eyes, a slight withdrawal, the involuntary flinch of a man who has been seen clearly for the first time and doesn't like what the seeing reveals. Clara understood then what she should have understood before she walked 7 miles in thin boots. The church received donations. The lumber company made donations. Marsh owed money to the lumber company. Everything connected to everything, and all of it connected to her 40 acres, sows, and none of it connected to justice. She left without finishing her tea. On the way home, she stopped at Ruth Calloway's homestead. Ruth was her last hope, the only person who might stand with her, the only friend she had left in a territory that was quickly becoming hostile to her existence. Ruth opened the door, and Clara could see immediately that Ruth already knew why she was there. News traveled fast, and the townships carried on the wind like seeds, and Marsh's visit to Clara's cabin was already common knowledge. Ruth's face showed the particular anguish of someone who wants to help but has already decided not to. I can't get involved in this, Clara. Marsh controls the land taxes, the timber permits, everything. If I stand against him, he'll come for my property next, and I have 2 children to feed. I'm not asking you to stand against him. I just need one person to witness that I'm still living on the land. One person to testify that I haven't abandoned the claim. Ruth's hands were shaking, not from cold, from the weight of what she was about to do. I'm sorry, Clara, I can't. Clara left. She walked the 3 miles home in silence. And during that walk, something fundamental shifted inside her, the way bedrock shifts during an earthquake, invisible on the surface but changing the shape of everything built on top of it. She was alone, not alone the way people say it when they mean lonely. Alone the way the last tree on a plain is alone with nothing between it and the wind in any direction. No law would protect her. No church would stand for her. No friend would risk anything for her. The entire structure of civilization, the courts, the clergy, the community was telling her the same thing. You do not have the right to exist by yourself. You are a woman alone, and a woman alone is not a person. You are a problem, and problems get solved. Clara reached her cabin as the sun was setting. She stood in front of it and looked at the land, her land, Eric's land, the 40 acres where they had planted their lives and where Eric's body lay in the frozen ground. She could leave. She could sell. She could remarry some man she didn't love and let Marsh have the timber and let the world be what the world had always been. Or she could find a way to stay that didn't require the world's permission. She went inside and closed the door. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall. It was the second week of December when the old woman appeared. Clara was splitting firewood behind the cabin, her breath coming in white clouds, her hands wrapped in rags because the blisters had never fully healed, when she looked up and saw a figure standing at the edge of the tree line that hadn't been there a moment before. She was very old. That was the first thing Clara noticed. Old the way trees are old, the way stones are old, not frail but ancient, as if age had compressed her rather than diminished her. She was Dakota, one of the last elders who still lived on the margins of the territory that had once belonged entirely to her people, and she moved through the snow with a silence that made Clara's skin prickle because no one that old should be able to move that quietly. You're trying to hide in a box that stands up and shouts, the old woman said, appearing at Clara's door as if she had materialized from the snow itself. Her English was accented but precise, learned over decades of living between 2 worlds. The earth can hide you better than any walls you build. Clara gripped the axe handle. Who are you? My people called me something your tongue can't say. The settlers call me Grandmother Fawn. It doesn't matter what you call me. What matters is that I've been watching you for 2 weeks and you're going to die before spring if you stay in that box. I'm not leaving my land. Grandmother Fawn's eyes, black and sharp as obsidian, moved from Clara to the cabin to the hillside beyond. I didn't say leave. I said stop hiding in a box. She paused. I've seen that look in your eyes before. On my daughter's face when they took her away. On my mother's face when they took our land. You're not the first woman to have everything stolen by a man with a piece of paper. But you might be the first one I can teach to fight back. Fight back how? The old woman smiled and her face creased into 1,000 lines of memory and patience, and something else, something that looked like the satisfaction of a person who has been waiting a very long time for someone to ask the right question. Come, I'll show you. She led Clara 2 miles through the snow to a hillside that rose gently from the prairie floor, covered in brown grass that bent in the winter wind, looking exactly like every other rise in the landscape for as far as the eye could see. There was nothing remarkable about it, nothing that would make a person stop or look twice or think that anything existed there except dirt and grass and the ordinary architecture of the earth. Then Grandmother Fawn knelt down, gripped a section of sod with both hands and pulled it back like a trap door. Beneath it was a room, not a cave, not a hole, a room with walls of packed earth reinforced by timber, a ceiling supported by beams that had been fitted together with a precision that spoke of generations of accumulated knowledge, and a floor of hard clay worn smooth by use. The entrance was concealed in a natural fold of the hillside, screened by brush that looked wild but had been placed with surgical deliberation. From any direction at any distance, in any season, this place was invisible. My people built like this for hundreds of years, Grandmother Fawn said. Before the houses came, before the fences, before your people decided the only way to live was to stack dead trees on top of each other and call it civilization. The earth is warmer than the air. 55 degrees, always, no matter how cold the wind blows above. Build into the hill, let the grass grow over you, and you disappear. The land holds you safe. Clara stared into the room beneath the prairie. She felt the warmth rising from it, felt the still air that carried no wind, no ice, no killing cold. She thought about her cabin, standing on the surface like a declaration visible from a mile away, as obvious as a shout. Can you teach me? The old woman's eyes held something that Clara would only understand years later. It was grief, but not the sharp kind. The slow kind. The kind that comes from watching everything you know get taken away piece by piece, generation by generation, until teaching one Swedish widow how to hide in the earth is the last act of preservation you have left. I can teach you everything, but you must be willing to let go of the world above. Clara looked back in the direction of her cabin, invisible beyond the snow-covered hills. She thought about Eric's grave behind it, about the wooden cross she had placed there, about the bent nail that still held the roof. She thought about Marsh and Webb and Ruth and all the people who had decided she didn't have the right to exist. There's nothing left in the world above that I want to keep. And so the education began. Through the darkest months of that first winter, while Marsh waited for the cold to do his work for him, Grandmother Fawn came every day walking 2 miles from wherever she lived, and Clara never asked where that was, and the old woman never told. She taught Clara to read the land the way her people had read it for 1,000 years, how to choose a hillside that would shed water in the spring instead of channeling it into your home, how to test the soil by feel, by smell, by the way it crumbled between your fingers, to know which earth would hold a ceiling and which would collapse under its own weight. She taught her to dig into the north side of the hill because the south side gets too much sun. The earth shifts, the grass dies, the secret reveals itself, but the north face stays cool, stays stable, stays hidden. The grass grows thick because the sun doesn't burn it, and underneath the earth remembers the warmth of summers past and holds it there, 55 degrees, a gift from the ground to anyone wise enough to accept it. She taught her to frame a room with timbers that would hold forever. Cottonwood for the main beams because it resists rot. Willow for the smaller supports because it bends without breaking. Everything cut and fitted so precisely that the joints needed no nails, each piece holding the next the way fingers interlace in prayer. She taught her to layer sod and grass so the roof would grow and heal and become invisible within a single season, until even someone standing directly on top of it would see nothing but prairie. And she taught her the chimney trick, a narrow pipe of fired clay that ran underground for 100 feet before emerging through the grass, far from the dwelling itself, disguised as a dead tree stump that Clara would hollow out and place there with her own hands. Smoke would rise from what appeared to be a rotting piece of wood, thin and pale, indistinguishable from morning mist, and no one would ever connect it to the warmth beneath the distant hillside. The work was brutal, harder than anything Clara had ever done, harder even than digging Eric's grave. She excavated the hillside with a shovel that raised new blisters on hands that had barely healed from the old ones. She hauled timbers from a deadfall 2 miles away, dragging logs through snow that reached her waist, falling and rising and falling again, her muscles screaming, her lungs burning in the frozen air. She cut sod in blocks that weighed more than she did, stacking them one on top of another until the roof took shape above her head. But the lodge grew. Day by day, week by week, it grew. One room became two, two became three, connected by low passages that followed the natural contours of the hill. Grandmother Fawn showed her how to carve storage alcoves into the earthen walls, how to build sleeping platforms at the right height to catch the rising warmth, how to create ventilation channels that kept the air fresh without letting in the cold. One evening near the end of February, Clara lay on the floor of the room she had built, too exhausted to move, looking up at the ceiling. Cottonwood beams that she had cut and dragged and lifted and fitted all by herself. Eric could have done it in a week. It had taken her 3 months. The joints weren't perfect. Some of the beams were slightly crooked, but they held. They were there. By the 1st of April 1857, the Earth Lodge was finished. It wasn't much to look at because it wasn't meant to be looked at. From any direction, from any distance, it appeared to be nothing more than a gentle rise in the land, covered with the same grass that grew everywhere else on the prairie. The door was hidden in a fold of the hillside, screened by a stand of brush that Grandmother Fawn had transplanted and trained to grow in exactly the right formation. Standing 10 feet away, you would walk past it without a second glance. Standing on top of it, you would feel nothing beneath your feet but solid ground. Clara moved in on that first day of April. She would never move out. Marsh came looking for her that spring. He came with a surveyor to measure the property lines, a lawyer to file the abandonment papers, and 3 men carrying axes to begin harvesting the timber that had always been his true interest. They walked the entire 40 acres. They searched every hollow, every draw, every stand of trees. They checked the creek bed and the far fence line and the rocky outcrop at the northwest corner, where a person might conceivably build a shelter. They found nothing. The cabin where Clara had lived with Eric stood empty, the door hanging open, leaves piling on the floor. There was no smoke rising anywhere on the property. There were no footprints, no cooking fires, no laundry on a line, no sign whatsoever that any human being had been present since the snow melted. Marsh signed the death certificate that same afternoon, standing on the porch of the empty cabin, using the lawyer's back as a writing surface. He signed it with a flourish that suggested relief more than sorrow, the signature of a man who has been waiting for a problem to solve itself and is pleased that it finally has. The widow Holberg had died during the winter exactly as he had predicted. The land was his. But Clara wasn't dead. She was 30 feet from where Marsh stood, watching through a gap in the earth so narrow that only a sliver of daylight came through, watching as the man who had promised the winter would kill her signed the paper that declared it had. She could see his face. She could see the satisfaction in it, the way his mouth curved upward at the corners, the way he looked at the timber on the hillside with the expression of a man counting money he hasn't yet earned. She heard him laugh. She heard him say something to the lawyer about foolish Swedish women who thought they could survive alone in a country that God built for men. She heard every word, and she said nothing, and she breathed so softly that the grass above her head didn't move. When they were gone, when the sound of horses faded to nothing, and the prairie was silent again, Clara climbed out of her hiding place and walked to the cabin. The death certificate was nailed to the door below a sign Marsh had posted in fresh paint. Territory land, no trespassing. She stood there for a long time looking at the sign. Her name was nowhere on it. Eric's name was nowhere on it. 3 years of their lives erased with paint and paper. The land that held Eric's body was now, according to every legal authority in the territory, the property of the man who had been waiting for her to die. Clara pulled the death certificate from the door. She folded it carefully and took it back to her earth lodge. She would keep it for 7 years, tucked into a crack in the wall where the firelight sometimes caught the ink and made the words glow. She never burned it. She never threw it away. She kept it the way a soldier keeps a bullet that missed him, as proof that the thing that was supposed to kill you didn't. That night, lying on her sleeping platform in the earth lodge, listening to the wind move across the grass above her, Clara tried to understand what she had become. She was alive. She was safe. She was invisible. The lodge held its warmth around her like cupped hands, 55 degrees of constant, reliable shelter, while the spring nights still dropped below freezing on the surface. She had food stored in alcoves carved into the walls. She had water from a spring that Grandmother Fawn had shown her how to find. She had everything she needed to survive. But she was also dead. Legally dead. Officially erased. The world above had decided she didn't exist, and she had let it because existing was the thing that would destroy her. She had traded her identity for her survival, her name for her safety, her place in the human world for a place in the earth. She closed her eyes. Above her, through the layers of soil and sod and prairie grass, she could hear the wind. It sounded like breathing, like the land itself was alive and holding her inside it the way the earth holds seeds through winter, waiting for the season when it's safe to grow again. She didn't know if that season would ever come. She didn't know if she would ever open her door and step back into the world of people and names and the dangerous visibility of being known. She knew only that she was here beneath the surface, alive in a grave the world had dug for her and she had made into a home. The grass would grow thicker every day. The spring would turn to summer. The earth would hold its warmth. And Clara Holberg, 27 years old, legally dead, utterly alone, would begin the longest disappearance in the history of the Minnesota prairie. 7 years underground, 7 years of silence, 7 years of learning that survival and living are not the same thing, and that the hardest door to open is the one you've locked from the inside. But all of that was still to come. For now, on this April night in 1857, Clara lay in the dark and listened to the earth breathe around her, and she held in her raw and blistered hands the only certainty she had left. She was here, and that would have to be enough. In the spring of 1858, Clara's second spring underground, a pair of red-tailed hawks built a nest on the ridge above her earth lodge. She watched them through the hidden gap near her ventilation channel, two birds carrying sticks and grass to a cottonwood snag building, something visible and permanent and exposed to every predator in the sky. She watched them for 3 weeks, and she envied them so deeply that it frightened her, because what she envied was not their freedom or their flight, but their willingness to be seen. That was the year Marsh brought the dogs. He arrived on a morning in late April with 4 men and 3 hounds, big-boned animals with long ears and wet noses that could track a deer across bare rock. Clara had spotted the party the night before. Grandmother Fawn had taught her to read the prairie after dark, to distinguish the flicker of a carried torch from the steady pulse of a distant star, to measure distance by the way light moved against the horizon. From 3 miles away, she saw them coming. She worked through the night. Every footpath she had worn near the entrance was raked and covered with dead grass. The hidden door was sealed so precisely that the sod edges matched the surrounding terrain without a visible seam. Around the entrance, in a wide perimeter, she scattered a mixture of wild herbs that Grandmother Fawn had shown her plants, whose sharp oils overwhelmed animal senses and turned scent trails into noise. By dawn, the hillside looked the way it had looked for 1,000 years. Empty, ordinary, meaningless. The dogs arrived at mid-morning. Clara lay beneath the earth and listened to them work the property, their noses sweeping the ground in wide arcs, their handlers calling encouragement. The hounds covered the 40 acres, methodically circling the old cabin crossing and recrossing the creek bed, pushing through the brush along the timber line. They found rabbit trails and fox dens in the place where a deer had bedded down the previous night. They found everything on the property that was alive except the woman who owned it. After 4 hours, the dogs lay down. Not in exhaustion, but in confusion, the particular surrender of an animal that has been asked to find something that its senses insist does not exist. The handlers pulled them up, tried again, and the dogs simply sat and looked at their masters with expressions that, if translated into human language, would have said, "There is nothing here." Marsh stood on the hillside directly above Clara's sleeping chamber. She could hear his boots shifting on the grass, could hear the creak of his leather belt, could hear the particular cadence of his breathing that she had memorized over 2 encounters and would never forget. He said nothing for a long time. Then he spoke, and his voice carried something she had never heard in it before. Not anger, not calculation, something closer to bewilderment. "Where is she? She has to be somewhere." One of his men suggested she had crossed into the next county. Another said she had probably remarried and moved east. Marsh shook his head at both suggestions. He stood on the hill and looked out across the 40 acres that should have been his by now, land that he had borrowed against and promised to deliver, and could not seem to claim no matter how many documents he signed, and Clara watched his shadow through the grass above her and understood that something had changed. The land was no longer just money to Aldrich Marsh. It was becoming personal. She was becoming personal. The woman who refused to die, the widow who wouldn't stay dead, the ghost that made a fool of him every spring. She could feel his frustration radiating through the earth like heat from a fire. And for the first time since she went underground, Clara felt something other than the dull ache of survival. She felt powerful. The feeling didn't last. Power requires someone to witness it, and Clara had no witnesses. She had the earth in the silence, in the hawks on the ridge, in the memory of a dead woman named Grandmother Fawn, who had given her everything and asked for nothing in return. But she had no one to talk to, no one to touch, no one to confirm that the person lying beneath the prairie grass was still a person and not just a heartbeat in the dark. The second year became the third. Seasons passed above her, and Clara began to notice something that disturbed her more than marsh or the bayous or any external threat. She was adapting, not just surviving, but settling the way sediment settles to the bottom of a still pond. She knew spring by the sound of meltwater finding new channels through the soil. She knew summer by the heaviness of the air in her ventilation shafts. She knew autumn by the silence that fell when the birds left. And she knew winter by the way the earth tightened around her lodge. She was reading the world through a membrane of dirt, and somewhere along the way she had stopped missing the world above it. That was the part that frightened her. Not that she was trapped underground, but that she was beginning to prefer it. It was in the summer of the third year that Marsh changed his approach. He stopped looking for a dead woman and started looking for a living one. And the reason was Ruth Calloway. Marsh had summoned Ruth to the township office on a July afternoon, ostensibly to discuss her own property taxes. Ruth came because refusing a summons from Judge Marsh was not something anyone in the eastern townships did not, if they wanted to keep their land and their peace and the fragile stability that passed for safety in a territory governed by men like him. The tax discussion lasted 5 minutes. Then Marsh leaned back in his chair and asked about Clara. When did you last see her before the winter, before she disappeared? Ruth said she didn't know anything. Her eyes dropped to the floor. Her fingers twisted the fabric of her sleeve. Marsh watched these movements with the practiced attention of a man who had spent decades reading liars across courtroom tables, and he saw exactly what Ruth was trying to hide. Not knowledge exactly. Fear. The specific fear of someone who knows more than she is saying. He pressed. His voice stayed level, almost conversational, but the words carried edges. If you're concealing information about territorial property, that's a criminal matter. Do you want your children growing up without their mother? Ruth broke, not completely. She didn't say Clara was alive because she genuinely didn't know if Clara was alive. But she said one sentence that she would regret for the rest of her days, a sentence that slipped out because fear is a solvent that dissolves judgment. Before winter started, Clara told me she would never leave that land, no matter what happened. It was enough. Marsh heard what Ruth didn't say. Clara had not walked into the snow to die. Clara had not abandoned the claim and moved away. Clara had told her closest friend that she intended to stay, and then she had vanished from the surface of the earth, and those two facts together meant only one thing. She was hiding. Somewhere on those 40 acres, the dead woman was alive. That was the summer Marsh hired Thomas Greer. Greer arrived in the territory in September, riding a gray mare that was as lean and quiet as the man himself. He was somewhere around 40 with a face that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts, a jaw that didn't quite match a nose that had been broken and reset at a slight angle, eyes that were different colors in different light. He had served as an Army scout during the conflicts in the Western Territories, tracking hostiles across terrain that would have killed most men simply by walking on it. After the Army, he had become a bounty hunter, a man who found people who didn't want to be found, and he was very good at it. Marsh met him at the edge of Clara's property and explained the situation. A widow believed dead, possibly hiding somewhere on 40 acres of prairie. No shelter visible, no tracks, no smoke. Dogs had failed. 2 years of searching had produced nothing. Greer listened without expression. Then he asked one question. Do you want the woman or the land? Marsh hesitated. It was a small hesitation, barely half a second, but Greer caught it the way he caught everything, with the passive, total awareness of a man whose survival had always depended on noticing what other people missed. The land, Marsh said. Greer nodded and rode onto the property alone. He didn't search the way the others had searched. He didn't walk the 40 acres looking for signs of habitation. He didn't check the obvious places, the hollows in creek beds and stands of timber where a person might build a shelter. Instead, he did something that terrified Clara more than the boss or the surveyor or Marsh's lawyers or any of the other threats that had passed above her in 3 years. He sat down and waited. For 3 days, Thomas Greer sat at different high points on the property and watched. He watched the way the grass moved in the wind. He watched the patterns of animal movement, which trails the deer used and which they avoided, where the rabbits fed and where they didn't. He watched the way water collected after a brief rain and which areas dried faster than they should have, and where the morning frost lingered a few minutes longer than the air temperature explained. On the third day, he walked to Clara's hillside. Clara was in the main chamber when she heard his boots. She had been preparing dried fish in the knife, Greer's own knife, the one he had not yet left for her, because this was the first time was in her hand when the footsteps stopped directly overhead. He didn't walk past. He didn't circle. He stopped and she heard him crouch, and she heard his palm press flat against the grass and through 2 feet of earth and sod. In silence, she felt the vibration of his touch run down through the soil like a current through water. He stayed there for a long time, long enough for Clara to count her own heartbeats, long enough for her to press both hands against her chest, because she was certain, absolutely certain, that the sound of her heart was traveling up through the earth and into his palm, and that he could feel her there alive and terrified and real beneath the grass. Greer felt the warmth. The soil beneath his hand was a fraction warmer than the soil around it, a difference so slight that 99 men out of 100 would never have noticed it. But Thomas Greer was the 100th man. He had spent his life noticing what other people missed, and he noticed this, and in that moment, he understood what he was kneeling on. He stood up slowly. He looked at the hillside. He looked at the way the grass grew slightly thicker, slightly greener, nourished by warmth that came from below. He looked at the fold in the earth where the entrance had to be hidden behind brush that was too perfectly placed to be natural. He saw it all, and Clara lying beneath him with her dead husband's memory and her absent teacher's wisdom and her crushing, suffocating isolation knew that he saw it. He walked away. He crossed the property to where Marsh was waiting at the tree line, and he said 6 words that saved Clara's life and haunted his own. "She's dead. Wolves took the body." Marsh asked if he was certain. Greer said he was. Marsh asked how he could be sure. Greer looked at him with those odd-colored eyes and said, "No woman could survive 3 winters alone out here without leaving some sign. There's no sign. She walked into the snow and died." That's the only explanation. Clara heard every word through the earth. She heard Greer lie for her, and she didn't understand why, and the not understanding was almost worse than the fear. Because in 3 years of isolation, she had lost the ability to comprehend why a stranger would choose to protect her. That night, after Marsh and Greer had left, she climbed out of her lodge in the dark and walked the perimeter the way she always did, checking for disturbance, erasing any trace of her emergence. Near the tree line, she found something that stopped her. A hunting knife, good steel-worn handle, the kind of blade a man carries for years until it becomes an extension of his hand. It was planted in a stump at the edge of the timber, its point angled toward the hillside. Not discarded. Placed. A message from a man who had found her and chosen not to say so, left in a language that needed no words. Clara pulled the knife from the wood. She held it in the moonlight, feeling its weight, its balance, the warmth that the metal had absorbed from the day and was slowly releasing into the dark. It was the first object she had received from the outside world since she went underground, the first evidence that someone beyond Grandmother Fawn knew she existed and had chosen to let her continue existing. She carried it back to her lodge and placed it beside her sleeping platform, and from that night forward, it was never out of reach. The 3rd year ended. The 4th year began, and with it came the loss that Clara had feared more than Marsh, more than discovery, more than the cold. Grandmother Fawn had died in her sleep during the winter that followed Greer's visit in the small earth lodge she had built for herself miles from anyone. Clara found her on a March morning when the first hints of spring were softening the frozen ground. She had walked to the old woman's lodge carrying news about early plants, the kind of information that Grandmother Fawn loved, details about which shoots were pushing through the soil earlier than expected, which roots were ready for harvest. She knocked on the entrance in the pattern they had established, 3 slow taps on a specific tree trunk. No answer. She knocked again. Silence. Inside, Grandmother Fawn lay on her sleeping platform with her hands folded across her chest and an expression of such complete tranquility that for a moment Clara thought she was simply sleeping more deeply than usual. Beside her was a small leather pouch, and inside the pouch was a carved wooden figure of a fawn, worn smooth by decades of handling, the edges softened by the oils of the old woman's skin until the wood looked less like carving and more like something that had grown naturally into that shape. Clara understood without being told. This was the last thing Grandmother Fawn had kept from before. Before the removals, before the losses, before the systematic dismantling of everything her people had built and known and been. This small wooden animal was the final artifact of a world that no longer existed, held in an old woman's hand, until the moment her hand stopped holding anything. Clara buried her on the hillside above the earth lodge, in soil that grandmother Fawn had taught her to read and respect and trust. She carved a marker so small that only someone who knew exactly where to look would ever find it. 5 words cut so faintly into the stone that they looked like natural weathering, the kind of marks that wind and rain make over centuries. She taught me to disappear. Clara stood beside the grave and cried. Not the controlled, suppressed grief that she had carried since Eric's death. Something deeper. Something that came from a place she had forgotten existed, a reservoir of human emotion that she had sealed off when she went underground, and that now broke open with a force that bent her double and put her on her knees in the dirt. She cried because grandmother Fawn was dead. She cried because the old woman was the last person on earth who knew Clara Holberg was alive. She cried because with this death, Clara's invisibility was complete, total, absolute. There was no longer a single human being anywhere who could confirm her existence. She was the perfect ghost, and being the perfect ghost was the loneliest thing she had ever experienced. The 4th year bled into the 5th. Clara maintained her routines with the mechanical precision of someone who has replaced purpose with procedure. She tended her hidden garden. She checked her traps. She fed her chickens in their half-buried coop. She moved across the property with the practiced silence of someone who has been invisible so long that visibility has become unimaginable. But something was eroding inside her. Not her skills, not her discipline, something more fundamental. The architecture of identity, the internal structure that tells a person who they are, was losing its load-bearing walls. She began talking to herself, not in madness, in desperation. She narrated her own actions because hearing a human voice, even her own, was the only proof she had that human beings still existed. I'm checking the east traps now. I'm walking along the creek. I'm going back inside. Simple sentences spoken to no one, serving no purpose except to push sound into a silence that had grown so thick it felt physical. She named the chickens. She named the hawks on the ridge. She gave a name to the spider that had built a web in the corner of her main chamber, and she spoke to it in the evenings, telling it about the weather outside, about what she had seen on her rounds, about the quality of the sunset that she had watched through her hidden observation point. The spider, she knew, could not hear her. That wasn't the point. The point was that forming words and directing them at a living creature was an act that connected her, however thinly, to the species she still technically belonged to. One night in February of the 4th winter, Clara woke in the dark and for several terrible seconds did not know who she was. Not amnesia, not confusion, something worse. A gap in the chain of self, a missing link between the person she had been and the person she was now, as if the two were connected by a rope that had finally frayed through. She lay on her sleeping platform and could not remember her own name. Not because the memory was gone, but because the name had lost its meaning. A name is a thing other people call you. When there are no other people, what is a name? She reached for the knife beside her platform. Greer's knife. She closed her fingers around the handle and held it in the darkness, feeling its weight, its realness. The fact that another human hand had gripped this same handle and left this same blade for her to find. It was the only physical evidence she possessed that the world above still contained people who knew something about her, even if what they knew was only the shape of the hill she lived under. She held the knife until she remembered her name. Then she lay awake until dawn, listening to the earth around her, wondering whether she was surviving or slowly ceasing to exist. It was in the 5th year that she saw Ruth again. She had ventured farther than usual, checking trap lines along the outer boundary of her property, moving through the timber with the fluid, soundless gait that 6 years of practice had made automatic. She came around a stand of birch and found herself face to face with Ruth Calloway, who was gathering kindling at the property's edge. Ruth screamed. Then she clapped both hands over her mouth and stared at Clara with an expression of such complete, unprocessed shock that Clara could see the whites of her eyes all the way around. "You're alive," Ruth whispered through her fingers. "Dear God, you're alive." Clara stood motionless. Ruth reached out to touch her, to grab her arm, to confirm through physical contact that the figure standing before her was flesh and not apparition. And Clara stepped backward, not out of anger, out of reflex. She had not been touched by another person in 5 years, and the approaching hand triggered something in her nervous system that was closer to threat response than social instinct. Her body had forgotten what friendly contact felt like. Ruth saw the retreat and dropped her hand. She began to cry. She apologized for everything, for refusing to help, for not standing with Clara when it mattered, for saying what she had said to Marsh. The words came out in a flood, years of guilt, released in a stream of broken sentences and wet eyes and shaking hands. Clara watched her the way a person watches rain through a window, present but separated, aware but uninvolved. 5 years of isolation had built a wall inside her that was more impenetrable than the earth walls of her lodge. "Don't tell anyone," Clara said. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, rusty from disuse, the consonants slightly blurred, as if the machinery of speech had developed a layer of corrosion during the years of silence. Ruth promised. And then Clara asked the question that had been sitting in her chest for 3 years. "What did you tell Marsh that second year?" Ruth went still. Every trace of color left her face. Clara had never confronted her about this, had never had the opportunity. But she had spent years watching the property from her hidden positions, tracking movement on the distant roads, noting the timing and direction of Marsh's searches. She had noticed the shift in his behavior after the second summer, the change from passive waiting to active hunting. Only Ruth had known enough to trigger that change. Ruth's confession came in fragments. Marsh's threats about her children, the summons to the township office, the sentence that slipped out, the one about Clara saying she would never leave. "He threatened to take my children, Clara. I didn't tell him you were alive. You gave him enough to know he should look harder." Silence. The wind moved through the birch trees. A hawk circled overhead, one of the pair from the ridge riding thermals with the effortless precision of a creature that has never had to hide from anything. "I understand why you did it," Clara said. "You chose your children. I would have done the same." But her voice was flat, stripped of warmth. She understood Ruth's choice intellectually the way a person understands a mathematical proof. The emotional comprehension, the empathy that would have come naturally to the Clara of 7 years ago was missing. 5 years underground had taught her to think in terms of survival and threat and resource management, and the emotional bandwidth required for forgiveness had been repurposed for other things. She turned and walked back toward her property. Behind her, she heard Ruth crying. She did not turn around. On the walk home, a new fear crystallized. Ruth had kept the secret for 3 years, but now Ruth knew Clara was alive. If Ruth told anyone, if the information reached Marsh, the stakes would change entirely. Marsh had signed 4 death certificates, 4 sworn legal documents declaring Clara Holberg deceased. If Clara was alive, those documents were fraudulent, and Marsh would face consequences far worse than losing a land claim. He would have a reason to make sure Clara really did disappear. Permanently. Clara reached her lodge and sealed the entrance behind her. She sat in the dark and calculated the odds that Ruth would keep her silence a second time. The odds were not good. Fear had broken Ruth before. Fear could break her again, and this time the secret was bigger. The 6th year brought Marsh back to the property, and this time he brought Greer with him. Not because he believed Clara was alive. The search had become ritual, annual compulsion, the behavior of a man driven not by logic, but by an obsession that had burrowed under his skin and refused to die. He needed Greer to sign a formal affidavit for the territorial court, a document swearing that a professional tracker had surveyed the property and confirmed it was abandoned. Greer rode onto the property and went straight to the hillside. He didn't search anywhere else. He didn't pretend to investigate the old cabin or the creek bed or the timber line. He walked to the hill and stood on it and looked down at the grass beneath his feet. It was winter, and this time the evidence was clearer. Snow sat on the surrounding terrain in a uniform white blanket, but on the hillside directly above Clara's main chamber, the snow was fractionally thinner. Not by much, not enough for a casual observer to notice. But Greer was not a casual observer, and the difference between the snow on this hill and the snow on every other hill within sight told him everything he needed to know. He walked back to where Marsh was waiting. "The land is abandoned. You can file with the court." He lied for her a second time. And this time when Marsh filed, the court rejected the claim again. No body, no proof of death, no transfer. Marsh slammed his fist on the desk. He shouted at his lawyer. He turned red and then pale and then a color that wasn't red or pale, but something worse, the color of a man whose frustration has fermented into something toxic. Greer stood in the corner of the courthouse and watched without expression. That evening, as the light was failing, he found Marsh at the tavern and said what he had come to say. "You should give up. That land doesn't want to belong to you. Marsh looked at him with bloodshot eyes. Land doesn't want anything, only people want. That's right, Greer said, and whoever is on that land wants it more than you do. He left that night and never returned to the territory. But 3 weeks later, when Clara made her rounds at the property edge, she found something. Not a knife this time. A footprint, deliberate and singular, pressed into the mud at the tree line pointing toward her hill. Beside it, scratched into the bark of a birch tree at knee height, a single mark. An arrow, pointing toward the hill. A farewell from a man who had found her twice and protected her twice and never asked for anything in return. Clara stood looking at the mark until the wind erased the footprint, and then she went back underground. The 7th year, the final year. Clara was 33 now, and the woman who emerged from the Earth Lodge each evening to watch the sunset bore little resemblance to the 26-year-old widow who had dug her husband's grave with bleeding hands in the autumn of 1856. Her hands were hardened beyond anything that could be called callous. They were instruments tools as adapted to their environment as the claws of the badgers she sometimes saw digging near the creek. Her eyes had adjusted to years of low light until bright sunshine caused a physical pain behind her forehead that took hours to fade. She could hear things through the earth that no surface dweller would ever detect: the vibration of approaching hoofbeats from a mile away, the subtle shift in soil pressure that preceded a rainstorm, the movement of groundwater in channels far below her floor. But she was losing other things. Language was slipping away from her. Sometimes she opened her mouth to narrate her actions, the habit that had kept her tethered to humanity, and found that the words wouldn't come. The gap between thought and speech had widened into a chasm. She couldn't remember the taste of bread. She couldn't remember what laughter sounded like. She remembered that both existed the way a person remembers a country they visited once as a child, knowing it is real, but unable to recall its shape. On the last day of December 1862, Clara stood at the entrance of her lodge and watched the sun set behind the western horizon. The sky was the color of old copper, and the prairie stretched away from her in every direction, endless and empty and patient. She had been underground for nearly 7 years. She had outlasted every prediction Marsh had made, every death certificate he had signed, every attempt to find her or remove her or prove that she no longer existed. She had won. But standing there in the dying light, she realized she didn't know what winning meant anymore. Marsh had not come that year. The court had stopped accepting his filings. The land sat in legal limbo, unclaimed, unresolved, a problem that the territory had quietly decided to ignore. If Marsh never came back, if no one ever challenged the claim again, what would she do? She would stay underground. She would maintain her routines. She would check her traps and tend her garden and feed her chickens and talk to the spider in the corner. She would live and survive and exist in perfect safety, in complete isolation, until she grew old and died alone in a chamber of earth that would become her grave, the same way it had become her home. Disappearing had been a strategy. It had become a habit, and habits don't need reasons. They just continue mindless and mechanical until something breaks them. Clara closed the door. Above her, the first stars appeared in a sky that didn't know she was watching. Somewhere to the north beyond the horizon, a weather system was building. Cold air from Canada was colliding with warm air from the south, and the collision was producing something that the old settlers would later describe as the worst storm in living memory. In 2 weeks, the blizzard would come, and beneath the earth, in a home that no one knew existed, Clara Holberg would hear a child crying through the frozen ground, and she would have to decide whether the woman who had spent 7 years learning to disappear still remembered how to be found. The blizzard announced itself the way catastrophe always does, with a silence that felt wrong. On the morning of January 15th, 1863, the air over the Minnesota prairie went perfectly still. No wind, no birdsong, no sound at all except the faint, high-pitched hum that comes when atmospheric pressure drops so fast that the air itself seems to vibrate with anticipation. Clara felt it before she heard it, deep in her earth lodge, where the soil transmitted vibrations. The way telegraph wire transmits code. She felt the barometric change as a tightening in her temples, a pressure behind her eyes that she had learned to read the way sailors read the color of the sea. She climbed to her observation point near the ventilation channel and looked north. The horizon had disappeared. In its place was a wall of white stretching from east to west as far as she could see, moving south with a speed that seemed impossible for something so massive. It looked less like weather than like the edge of the world advancing, erasing the landscape as it came, swallowing the prairie mile by mile into a whiteness that was not empty, but full, dense with snow and wind, and the particular violence that nature reserves for the moments when it decides to remind human beings what they actually are. The temperature had been 20 degrees at dawn. By 10 in the morning, it was -5. By noon, the thermometer that Clara kept near her entrance had stopped moving at -30, and the wind had reached a sustained fury that drove the snow horizontally so thick and fast that the air became a solid white substance through which nothing could be seen and nothing could survive. Clara sealed her entrance and went below. The lodge held its warmth around her steady and constant, while the world above tore itself apart. She stoked the fire. She checked her food stores. She settled into the main chamber and listened to the storm the way she listened to everything now through the earth, reading the vibrations and pressures and subtle shifts that told her what was happening on the surface without requiring her to be there. The storm raged through the night, and then through the next day, and then through the night after that. Clara slept and woke and slept, and in each time she woke, the storm was still screaming above her, the pressure waves rolling through the soil with a rhythm that she could feel in her bones. On the second day, the search party set out from town. She didn't know this at first. She learned it in pieces through sounds filtered through frozen earth and 15 feet of drifted snow. The crunch of snowshoes, the muffled calls of men shouting to be heard over the wind, the particular cadence of organized movement, people walking in formation, following a leader, stopping and starting at intervals that suggested they were searching for something. They were searching for survivors. Judge Aldrich Marsh led them because it was his legal obligation, though Clara, listening from below, could hear in his voice the exhaustion and reluctance of a man performing a duty he considered futile. 17 men followed him along with 3 women and 6 children who had been pulled from collapsed homesteads, along the route survivors who had nowhere else to go and no choice but to stumble forward with the search party because stopping meant dying. Among them was a young carpenter named Jonas Lindgren, 28 years old, who had joined the search not out of loyalty to Marsh, but because he owned a pair of good snowshoes and knew how to read snow the way some men read maps, understanding its depth and density and the treacherous places where a drift could swallow a person whole. Jonas had argued with Marsh twice already, once when Marsh wanted to bypass a collapsed homestead because it was too far off the route, and once when Marsh suggested they turn back entirely. Both times Jonas had won the argument through the simple method of continuing to walk in the right direction while Marsh stood behind him shouting orders that no one followed. Clara heard their voices passing overhead on the first day, then again on the second, then again on the third. 17 times in 3 days, the search party crossed the hillside above her lodge. She heard Marsh's voice growing hoarser and more desperate with each pass. She heard him counting survivors, calculating losses, the arithmetic of catastrophe performed in a voice that cracked with cold and fatigue. She heard him declare for the 4th time in 7 years that Clara Holberg must certainly be dead. And she heard Ruth Calloway's silence. Ruth was among the survivors. Clara recognized her breathing, the particular way Ruth inhaled before speaking, and then didn't speak, a pattern Clara had known since the days when they were friends, and Ruth would start to say something honest and then swallow it. Ruth was up there walking over Clara's roof, knowing what lay beneath and saying nothing. But this time Clara understood Ruth's silence was not betrayal. Ruth was keeping the secret Clara had asked her to keep. The cost was that 41 people were staggering through a blizzard that was killing them by the hour, and safety was directly beneath their feet, and the one person who knew it couldn't say so without exposing everything. On the 3rd afternoon, Marsh called a halt. Clara heard him through the earth, his voice stripped to a rasp, the words coming slowly. "We turn back. No one can be alive out here. We've done what we can." Then another voice, younger, stubborn. The voice Clara had heard arguing with Marsh before, though she didn't know the name that belonged to it. "There are people out here, Judge. We don't stop. We'll die if we keep going. Then we die trying to save someone. That's not the worst way to go." A pause. The wind filled it with sound that was almost language, a howling that rose and fell, like speech in a tongue no living person spoke. Then the group moved on, and Clara heard their footsteps receding, and she thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. 20 minutes later, she heard the child. It was a small sound, so small that it should have been impossible to hear through snow and frozen earth and the relentless scream of the wind. But 7 years of living beneath the surface had tuned Clara's hearing to a sensitivity that bordered on supernatural. She could distinguish the footfall of a rabbit from the footfall of a fox through 3 feet of soil. She could hear groundwater moving in channels 10 feet below her floor. And she heard this, a child crying, not loudly, not with the full-throated wail of a child demanding attention. This was the thin, reedy sound of a child who has gone past demanding and past hoping and is now simply making the last noise it will ever make, the sound a small body produces when it has exhausted every other option and is announcing its own ending to an indifferent sky. Clara stood in the center of her lodge. The fire was burning. The walls radiated their constant warmth. She was safe. She had been safe for 7 years, safer than any other person on the Minnesota prairie, protected by earth and silence, and the perfected art of not existing. She could stay where she was. She could let the search party pass. She could let the storm run its course and emerge in the spring to find whatever the blizzard had left behind, and she could continue her invisible life in her invisible home, and no one would ever know the difference. Her hand found the knife at her belt. Greer's knife, worn smooth by 3 years of daily use, the handle shaped to her grip. The blade she had used to gut fish and cut rope and carve markers and do all the small, essential work of staying alive. She held it and felt its weight and thought about the man who had left it for her, a man who had found her and lied for her and walked away, a man who had chosen twice to protect a stranger at the cost of his own integrity. The child cried again. Closer now, or the wind had shifted, or Clara's ears had locked onto the frequency the way a compass locks onto north. The sound came through the earth and into her body and settled somewhere in her chest, in a place that 7 years of silence and isolation had not managed to kill, a place she had forgotten existed. She thought about grandmother Fawn. Not her words, her hands. The way the old woman's hands had moved when she was teaching Clara to fit timber joints, patient and precise hands that carried the knowledge of generations, hands that had chosen to pass that knowledge to a stranger because the alternative was letting it die. Grandmother Fawn had not hidden because she wanted to disappear. She had hidden because the world had given her no other choice. And when she found someone who needed what she knew, she had opened her door. Clara crossed the chamber in 4 steps. She gripped the timber bar that secured the entrance and lifted it from its brackets. She pushed the door outward against the weight of the snow and felt the cold hit her face with a force that was less temperature than assault, a physical blow that drove the breath from her lungs and froze the moisture in her nostrils and turned the world into a white, roaring, formless chaos. She stepped out. The search party was 40 feet away when the hillside opened. They had already passed the spot. They were moving south, heads down, bodies curved against the wind, a line of shapes so encrusted with ice that they looked less like people than like formations of winter, itself geological features that had learned to walk. Jonas Lindgren was at the rear, carrying a child on his back and holding a woman's arm with his free hand, and he was the first to see it. The hills split open. That's how it looked to him. A section of the earth simply parted, and from inside it emerged a figure backlit by firelight. A woman standing in a doorway that shouldn't exist. Warmth pouring out around her into the killing cold like something from a fever dream or old country fairy tale. A vision so impossible that Jonas stopped walking and stared and felt the child on his back stop crying. "Come in," the woman said. "There's room." They came in. All of them. 26 people who had been minutes from death stumbled and crawled and were carried into a space that rose up from beneath the prairie like an answer to a prayer no one had known how to pray. They felt the warmth, constant, unshakable warmth that radiated from walls of earth and filled the chambers with air that smelled like soil and smoke and survival. They moved deeper, following passages that turned and branched and opened into rooms that had been carved and shaped, and lived in rooms with sleeping platforms and storage alcoves, and a fire that burned with the steady, untroubled patience of a flame that has been tended for 7 years by hands that had nothing else to tend. They collapsed. They wept. They held their children and felt the ice melting from their clothes and could not speak because the distance between where they had been dying in white nothing and where they were now alive in a home made of earth was too vast for language to cross. Aldrich Marsh was the last to enter. He stood at the threshold of the lodge and looked into the face of the woman he had declared dead 4 times, the woman whose land he had tried to steal, whose existence he had denied, whose death he had wished for and predicted and legally certified on documents filed with the territorial court. He stood there and his face showed something that none of the survivors had ever seen on it before. Not anger, not calculation, not the practiced authority he wore the way other men wore hats. Something raw, something involuntary. The expression of a man who has walked into a room and found that everything he believed about the world was wrong. "You're alive," he said. "I've always been alive. You just couldn't find me." The silence that followed those words lasted long enough for the fire to pop twice and for a piece of ash to drift from the ceiling and land on Marsh's shoulder without his noticing. Then his face changed, and what replaced the shock was not humility, not yet. First came anger. "You lied to me. You made me look like a fool in front of the court for 7 years." Clara looked at him. She had spent 7 years beneath this man's feet, listening to his voice, studying the rhythms of his speech, memorizing the sound of his boots on her roof. She knew him better than anyone alive, and he had never known she existed. "You tried to take a widow's land 3 days after she buried her husband. Who lied to whom?" Jonas Lindgren stepped between them. He was still carrying the child on his back, a girl of perhaps 4, whose face was blue-white with cold, but whose eyes were open and watching everything with the stunned attention of someone who has been pulled from one world into another. Jonas looked at Marsh and said 3 words that carried the weight of everything the search party had endured. "She just saved us." Marsh said nothing. He moved deeper into the lodge and sat down against a wall and put his face in his hands and did not speak again for hours. They stayed for 9 days. 41 people in chambers built for one, sharing food that Clara had stored for a single winter, drinking water from a spring that had never needed to supply more than a single throat. Clara rationed everything with the precision of someone who had spent 7 years calculating exactly how much she needed to survive, and who now had to recalculate for 41. On the second night, a man from the search party, a farmer named Colton, with heavy hands and a voice accustomed to being obeyed, went to Clara's main storage alcove and began pulling out dried fish without asking. Jonas caught his wrist. "This is her home. She's sharing with us because she chooses to. You ask before you take." Colton looked at Jonas's hand on his wrist, and then at Jonas's face, and then at the room full of people who were watching and whose survival depended on the food in that alcove being managed by someone who knew what she was doing. He put the fish back. On the third night, when the others were sleeping in shifts across every available surface, Ruth Calloway crawled across the floor to where Clara sat by the fire. Ruth's children were asleep on a platform nearby, wrapped in one of Clara's blankets, their breathing steady and even for the first time in days. Ruth didn't speak immediately. She sat next to Clara and looked at the fire and listened to the storm still raging overhead, muted now by layers of earth and snow that turned the shrieking wind into a low, continuous hum. "I knew you were down here," Ruth finally said. "I was walking over you. I knew, and I didn't say anything." Clara waited. "You told me not to tell anyone. And I kept that promise. I kept it while 40 people were freezing to death on top of you." Ruth's voice cracked. "Was I right? Was keeping your secret worth letting people die?" Clara considered this. It was the first genuine moral question anyone had asked her in 7 years, and she found that the part of her mind that processed such questions had atrophied from disuse, stiff and slow, like a joint that hasn't been bent in years. "You didn't let anyone die," Clara said. "I opened the door. But if you hadn't, then it would have been my choice, not yours." Ruth sat with that for a long time. Then she said so quietly that Clara almost missed it beneath the hum of the storm. "I should have helped you 7 years ago. When you asked me to witness for you, I should have said yes." Clara said nothing. Forgiveness was not something she could offer yet. The machinery for it existed somewhere inside her, she was certain of it, but it was buried under 7 years of scar tissue and silence, and excavating it would take longer than one conversation in a storm. But she did not move away. And when Ruth's hand reached out and rested on her arm, Clara did not pull back. She let it stay. The warmth of another person's touch, the first voluntary human contact she had allowed in 5 years, traveled through her skin and into her blood and reached a place so deep that she had forgotten it was there. On the 7th day, Clara found Marsh sitting alone in the narrow passage between 2 chambers, the coldest spot in the lodge, as far from other people as the architecture allowed. He had been quiet for days, a silence so complete and so unlike the man Clara had studied for 7 years that it unsettled her more than his anger had. Jonas found him there and sat down beside him. The 2 men had barely spoken during the ordeal, separated by age and temperament, and the basic fact that Jonas respected Clara and Marsh did not know how to. "She built all of this," Jonas said. It wasn't a question. He had spent the week examining the construction, the timber joints, the ventilation, the way the passages followed the contours of the hill, and the craftsman in him recognized the work of someone who had learned a trade from a master and then improved upon it through years of solitary practice. Marsh said nothing for a while. Then he spoke, and his voice was different, not softer, emptier, as if something had been removed from it, some load-bearing structure that had held up his certainty for decades. And the voice that remained was just a voice, just a man talking without authority or performance, or the armored confidence of a judge who had never been wrong. I signed 4 death certificates. 4 times I swore before God and the court that this woman was dead. And 4 times she was right here, right under my feet. He paused. I told myself I was enforcing the law. The land had no legal owner. A woman alone couldn't hold a claim. I was doing what the territory required. Another pause longer. But the land did have an owner. She was 30 feet below me, feeding herself from earth I was trying to put my name on. Jonas said nothing. Some confessions don't need a response. They need a witness, and Jonas sat and witnessed while Marsh spoke words that seemed to cost him something physical, as if each sentence was a stone he was pulling from his own chest. On the 9th day, the storm broke. The wind dropped from a scream to a whisper to nothing, and the silence that followed was so sudden and so complete that several people woke from sleep believing something terrible had happened. Clara opened the entrance and pushed through the snow that had packed against it and emerged into a world transformed. The prairie was gone, replaced by a white plain that extended in every direction without feature or landmark, a blank page on which nothing had yet been written. The sun was out. The sky was the deep, impossible blue that only appears after the worst storms, as if the violence had scrubbed the atmosphere clean and left behind nothing but color and light. The survivors climbed out one by one, blinking, shielding their eyes, stepping onto the snow with the tentative, disbelieving movements of people who had been given back a world they had accepted they would never see again. That spring, Marsh stood before the survivors and the townspeople who had gathered to hear the story of the 41 people who had been swallowed by the blizzard and returned alive. He stood in front of the courthouse where he had filed his papers and signed his certificates and exercised his authority for 20 years, and he made a confession. I tried to take her land, he said. His voice was rough with something that was not illness and was not cold. I declared her dead when she was alive. I wanted what she had, and I didn't care what happened to her to get it. He looked at the faces in the crowd, the faces of the people Clara had sheltered, and found his own reflection in their eyes. We walked over her roof for 3 days. 3 days, and she could have stayed hidden. She could have waited until we were all frozen and come out in the spring, and no one would have ever known we were there. But she heard a child crying, and she opened her door. He turned to Clara, who stood at the edge of the gathering, not at its center, because 7 years of invisibility had made the center of any group feel like a place she did not belong. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I want you to know that I understand now. You didn't disappear because you were weak. You disappeared because every person and every institution that should have protected you chose not to. And when we needed you, when we were dying on your land, you chose differently than we chose. You opened your door. Clara looked at him. She looked at this man who had tried to erase her from the surface of the earth, who had signed her death and hunted her survival, and wanted the trees on her hillside more than he wanted justice. She looked at him and searched for hatred and found that it was gone, not because she had forgiven him, but because 7 years underground had burned away everything that was not essential, and hatred she discovered was not essential. It was heavy, it was expensive, and she had learned to carry only what she needed. My grandmother taught me to build this home, she said. She used the word grandmother because Grandmother Fawn had become exactly that, the only family Clara had during the years of vanishing, the only elder, the only teacher, the only person who had looked at her and seen someone worth saving. She taught me that the earth will hold you safe when the world above is dangerous, but she also taught me that hiding isn't living, it's waiting. Clara paused. She looked at the survivors, at the people who had walked over her roof and never known she was there, at the children who had slept on her platforms and eaten her food, at Ruth, who stood in the back row with red eyes and clenched fists. I survived 7 winters alone because I had no other choice. But when I heard that child crying through the earth, I remembered something my husband used to say. She did not repeat the words. She didn't need to. The meaning was there in the fact that she was standing in sunlight, speaking to people choosing to be visible after 7 years of choosing to disappear. We're not meant to do this alone. We're meant to find each other. She looked at the crowd once more. Anyone who wants to learn, I'll teach. The earth can hold all of us. Marsh resigned his position as judge the following month. He spent his remaining years helping families in the territory build earth shelters, traveling from homestead to homestead with the fervent, tireless energy of a man trying to outrun his own past. He taught what Clara taught him imperfectly, with the clumsy hands of someone who had spent his life working with paper and law and was only now learning to work with soil and timber. Some of the shelters he helped build collapsed. Some leaked. Some were abandoned within a year. But some held, and the families who lived in them survived winters that killed their neighbors, and those families remembered who had helped them and why. He died in 1871, 8 years after the blizzard. His gravestone bore 6 words that he had chosen himself, dictated to the stonecutter from his bed in the final weeks, spoken with the particular clarity of a man who knows exactly what he wants, written on the last surface that will carry his name. She could have let him die. She didn't. Jonas Lindgren returned to Clara's property in April, 3 months after the blizzard. He came alone, carrying a canvas sack of carpentry tools over one shoulder, and he walked to the entrance of the Earth Lodge and stood there for a moment, looking at the door that had opened to save his life. The door that now blended so perfectly into the hillside that he had to search for it, even though he knew exactly where it was. Clara appeared in the doorway. "I can make that door frame stronger," Jonas said. Clara looked at him, at his tools, at the quiet certainty in his face, the expression of a man who communicates through the work of his hands rather than the production of words. "Nobody said it needed to be stronger." "No, but I'd like to help." He came back every week. He reinforced the door frame. He replaced a sleeping platform whose supports had begun to bow. He carved new shelving for the storage alcoves, better than what Clara had built, fitted with the joints of a trained craftsman who understood wood the way grandmother Fawn had understood earth. He didn't talk much. He worked. And Clara, who had spent 7 years in the company of silence, found that his silence was different from hers. Hers had been the silence of absence of nothing. His was the silence of presence, of someone who was simply there, asking nothing, offering what he had, letting his existence speak for itself. She grew accustomed to the sound of his tools in the passage. She grew accustomed to finding small improvements in the lodge that she hadn't asked for. A ventilation shaft widened, a rough edge smoothed a crack in the wall, sealed with clay, so expertly mixed that it matched the color of the surrounding earth. She grew accustomed to the particular weight of his footsteps on the floor, different from every other footstep she had memorized in 7 years. Lighter than Marsh's, steadier than the searcher's, present in a way that asked for nothing except the privilege of return. A year after the blizzard, Jonas stayed through the night for the first time. Not because anything was said, because the light was failing and the work wasn't finished, and Clara didn't ask him to leave, and he didn't move toward the door. They sat on opposite sides of the fire and ate dried venison in a silence that was, for the first time in Clara's memory, comfortable. He never officially moved in. He simply stopped leaving. The way snow settles into the contours of the land, the way water finds the lowest point and stays, Jonas became part of the lodge without announcement or ceremony. They married the following spring in a small gathering on the hillside above the entrance, with 6 witnesses and no minister. Clara had had enough of ministers. They raised 4 children in those earthen chambers. 2 boys and 2 girls, all of whom learned to read the soil and frame a timber joint and vanish into a hillside before they learned to read books. The oldest daughter, whom they named Fawn, grew up to teach the old building methods to families across 3 counties, carrying forward the knowledge that grandmother Fawn had carried forward from her own grandmother, a chain of teaching that stretched back through generations too numerous to count. Ruth Calloway became the nearest thing Clara had to a neighbor again, though the friendship never returned to what it had been before. Something had been broken in the space between Ruth's first refusal and her confession in the storm, and while the break healed, it healed the way bones heal, functional, but changed the mended place, always slightly different from the original. They didn't speak about the past. They didn't need to. Every autumn, Ruth walked to the hillside carrying a jar of salt-cured meat, the same recipe she had taught Clara in the first year of Clara's marriage. Before Eric died, before Marsh came, before any of it. She left it at the entrance and walked away, and Clara found it and brought it inside, and neither woman ever mentioned it, and both understood exactly what it meant. In the summer of 1878, 15 years after the blizzard, Clara received a package delivered by a postal rider who had no idea who had sent it. Inside was a leather-bound notebook filled with careful handwriting, page after page of detailed descriptions of indigenous building techniques, earthen shelters and underground lodges, and subterranean food storage documented with the methodical precision of someone who had spent years traveling and observing and recording what he found. There was no name on the cover, no return address, no letter of explanation. On the inside of the front cover in handwriting that Clara recognized even after 15 years, because she had seen it once before scratched into the bark of a birch tree at the edge of her property, there was a single line. For the hill. Clara held the notebook in hands that were no longer young, but were still strong hands that had dug a home from the earth and raised children in it and opened a door that saved 41 lives. She turned the pages, slowly reading descriptions of structures that Grandmother Fawn would have recognized, techniques that the old woman had taught her, and that she had taught her children, and that her children would teach to strangers who would teach to their own children, a widening circle of knowledge that had begun with one old woman and one young widow on a winter afternoon when the world was trying to erase them both. She closed the notebook and put it on the shelf beside Grandmother Fawn's wooden fawn, the small carved figure that Clara had kept for 15 years and that her daughter Fawn would keep after her, and that Fawn's daughter would keep after that, each generation holding the artifact a little more carefully than the last, understanding that what they held was not a piece of wood but a piece of memory, the physical remains of a woman who had refused to let everything she knew die with her. Clara Holberg lived to be 67, 40 years in the Earth Lodge, 40 years of seasons passing overhead, 40 years of grass growing and dying and growing again on a roof that held its shape while everything around it changed. She died in the spring of 1897, in the chamber she had dug with her own hands when she was 27 years old on a sleeping platform that Jonas had rebuilt 3 times over the decades, because the original kept wearing out and he kept making it better. Jonas buried her on the hillside next to Grandmother Fawn in soil that both women had taught him to understand. He carved the marker himself because he was a carpenter, and carving was what his hands did when words were not enough. He didn't write her name. He didn't write dates or scripture or any of the conventional phrases that people put on stones to summarize a life. He wrote 5 words, the same number Grandmother Fawn's marker bore, because some things are symmetrical, not by design, but by rightness. The door is still open. The phrase Holberg's Hill entered the vocabulary of Minnesota and stayed there the way certain phrases do when they describe something that no other combination of words can capture. It came to mean any refuge that hides in plain sight, any safety that comes from becoming part of the land instead of fighting against it, any strength that the world mistakes for weakness because it cannot see what lies beneath the surface. When people searched for something they couldn't find, the old-timers in the eastern townships would shake their heads and say, maybe it's a Holberg's Hill, maybe it's been there all along. The Earth Lodge is still there. After more than 160 years, the grass has grown and died, and grown again 1,000 times. The prairie looks exactly as it did before Clara ever came, before Eric ever drove a crooked nail into a roof beam, before Grandmother Fawn ever pulled back a section of sod and showed a grieving widow that the earth remembers summer, even when the world above has forgotten it. The timbers have darkened with age, but they hold. The walls have settled, but they stand. The ventilation channels still draw air, and the chambers still hold their warmth. And if you were to walk across that hillside on a winter day, you would see nothing but grass and snow and the ordinary, unremarkable contour of the land. But beneath the surface, in rooms that the world forgot were ever there, the earth still holds its warmth. And the door that a woman opened because she heard a child crying and remembered that disappearing is not the same as living, that door is still there, still set in its frame, still ready to open for anyone patient enough to look beneath the surface and brave enough to knock. Some stories end with the hero standing in the spotlight, vindicated, celebrated, remembered in bronze and marble. This one ends with grass growing over a hillside in Minnesota, quiet and ordinary and invisible the way Clara would have wanted it. Not a monument, not a memorial. Just a door in the earth, and behind it the steady, constant warmth that the land has been holding for 160 years, waiting for whoever needs it next.